Thank you so much for having me here. This is an important space. I always feel honored to join in on different spaces for people who have all kinds of personal and professional reasons to be concerned about this sensitive topic. Uh, this is also very good timing, as it turns out. When this was planned, we could not have predicted that the Dutch government would come out and suspend intercountry adoptions and come out with such a clear report, which for many of us who have been in this field for a long time, many of my colleagues, myself as well, feels like vindication. So for me, this suspension of intercountry adoption, which I doubt it's much influence of mine, it's a culmination of a lot of people and a lot of work, but it does track the topic of this paper that I told Ryan I wanted to present some weeks ago, Moratoria, which called for suspension. Moratoria, it's two words for the same thing, called for a similar pause in intercountry adoption. I don't claim to be the most radical in viewpoint or to be first anywhere. Many people have been more radical than I do, but I do try to ground what I do in international children's rights. So what I've been trying to do is not just reflect my own experience and my own viewpoints, but to say that if you're going to have a use of family formation, and I'll talk about surrogacy a little bit. I was told it was okay to do that towards the end, but principally intercountry adoption today. So if you're going to have this method of family formation, it needs to be done in accordance with international children's rights and also human rights standards. And so the basis of what I'll be talking about today will be the CRC, Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Hague Adoption Convention, which is only sensible if it's built on that child rights foundation, the optional protocol on sale, the trafficking Palermo protocol. These are the legal bases for what I'm talking about. Now, I have to acknowledge at the start, which is well known, just to be transparent, but most people know this, that I got into this in a very difficult way. Our family adopted two older girls from India who were illicitly, I would say, trafficked, placed in our family, nearly destroyed our family. Terrible effect upon Lakshmi, the mother back in South India, and that family. It's a set of relationships we've been navigating now for like 20 years. So that gave me, I went in as naive and stupid as anybody. It's one of the things that makes me very patient in this area is however naive somebody may be going in, I was more naive. So, I try to keep that in mind. Uh, why now moratoria? I mean, some people have been right about this longer than I have, but I'll give you the basis of the argument, okay, that I place in the paper. The basic argument is going back 70 years, and some of you here helped me arrive at that figure, 70 years, so thank you, Gonda. But going back 70 years, I came to the conclusion that the majority of intercountry adoptions globally came through systems that were systemically corrupted. Now, the Dutch report uses this kind of language of systemic. I mean, we talk about systemic racism. This is a systemically corrupted system. But I mean that in a very particular way. I mean that the majority of those intercountry adoptions should never have happened in the core sense that the children should never have been apart from their families. You can talk about corruption in terms of bribery, you can talk about corruption in terms of document fraud, but sometimes those things happen for an adoption that is ethically otherwise proper. And I'm not going to argue, does that make that okay? When people bribe recalcitrant government officials to get something done that should be done, that is a problem. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is much more fundamental. These are children who never should have lost their original identity. And in terms of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, we're talking about a legal regime in which children as human beings are born with rights to their family relations, as well as their name and their nationality. And that should not be taken from them unless it's necessary, okay? Now, it's this original break with the family or the failure to reunify when it should have been done. That's what I am looking at as a violation of basic human rights, not a theoretical violation, but a core one that impacts across generations echoes across people's lives across the world. And so I'm not claiming that the majority of individual adoptions were wrong in that way, but the majority came through systems that were wrong in that way. And therefore, most of the people coming through that system, unless they do a search, do not really know whether or not they were properly separated from their families, whether all the losses that are intrinsic to adoption were in any way necessary. Okay, so what are the forms of illicit practices that I'm talking about here? Okay, first of all, I did not invent, but did popularize many years ago the term child laundering. I want to give it some more specificity for those of you not as aware of that term. It's not really strictly a legal term, but child laundering I use to describe the way that children are removed from their families by force, fraud, or funds. Force, fraud, or funds. Force, literal kidnapping, funds being purchased. Fraud, which is one of the most common and often accompanying these other things, has to do with the fact that in much of the world, families do not understand this concept. It's foreign to their culture, to their legal system, to their mindset that they can sign a document and be permanently severed from a legal or practical relationship with their children. So it's often a fraud that they don't understand what they're signing. They don't understand what the consequences of when they sign a quote permission for adoption. So children are removed by force, fraud, or funds in an illegal, illicit way, and then they're given paperwork that makes them, and many people made films with these titles, paper orphans. On paper, they are orphans. They've been made adoption eligible. And then at that point going forward, everything looks clean and proper. Okay, they get the proper paperwork, proper visa, the proper passport. It all looks good on paper if you just look at the paper trail, but it's at the source it was rotten. Okay. Now that's one kind of illicit practice. There's at least two others that I want to focus on, okay? The other is poverty. And here, I wrote an article, poverty, and intercountry adoption. UNICEF has been clear about this. I don't think it should be ethically controversial, but poverty is not an indication for international adoption. Poverty, where it threatens the ability of the family to maintain their ties with the child, should be alleviated in poverty alleviation ways, not family severance ways. Right. Now that principle, I think, is clear from the CRC. It's not necessarily clear from the Hague Convention itself, I have to say, but you have to build the Hague Convention on top of the CRC. And if you understand, the CRC is built upon a broader human rights foundation. And in that context, it's very strange, but in many places around the world, India, Nepal, African adoptions, Latin American adoptions, it's been normalized that poverty is the reason that this family is quote unquote placing this child. And it's been normalized that when the family comes into interaction with a system, they're not offered assistance as an alternative to losing their child, okay? But to me, that not only is unethical and violates human rights norms, it's also a financial absurdity, because typically when you're dealing with developing countries over the last 70 years, the cost of just travel, even without any illicit or high costs of intermediaries or anyone else, just the cost of transporting the child would have been enough to allow the child to stay with their family. When you're talking about India, Nepal, Ethiopia, Cambodia, and on through many countries. So the fact that that is normalized in the actual operation of many intercountry adoption systems, and yet it's a clear wrong. It's not a proper basis. That is one of the things that makes me able to say that so many of these systems were systemically corrupt, as well as the child laundering. Another problem, which is a more recent norm, not as clearly reflected in the CRC, not reflected in the Hague, but more reflected in the guidelines for the alternative care of children, which is a document I did not mention at first, but the guidelines for the alternative care of children is sort of soft international law. It's a UN document. It's not a treaty. It's not as binding, but it makes clear the notion that being a single parent should not be an indication for adoption or for intercountry adoption.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And of course, for the Korean story, that's so central because, many of you know the Korean story far more than I would claim to. I've been to South Korea for a couple of weeks. I'm not nearly as expert in it as many of you, okay? I've learned from some of the best in that field, I think, so I try to learn in all these different countries, lacking the language and the cultural skills to, be up to date on, South Korea, China, Ethiopia, Latin America, all these different cultures and places. So I kind of count on people who really know those places. But the South Korean story has been so well documented, including by many adoptee scholars, as of course, once you get past the war years, and once you get past the poverty years, it endemically is all about the single mother. And it's about a society in which, being a single mother is socially and legally completely unsupported in any way. In fact, it's virtually impossible to keep your child, as I had interactions with one of the mothers groups in South Korea some years ago when I was there, all of the cultural, social, financial obstacles to that. And so if you add that in to the mix, which occurs not only, massively in South Korea, but in many other societies, and also occurs in the background history of the sort of harvesting of children for domestic adoption in many Western countries like the US during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So it's part of many domestic system history background in so-called Western countries as well. If you add that in, these basic, three norms: no child laundering, poverty is not an indication, being a single mother is not. It's pretty easy for me to say, looking from country to country, that the majority of these inter-country adoptions should never have occurred. That's point one. Point two, there's never been a remedy. There's never been a remedy. We've gone 70 years, okay? When I say never, there are individual cases. People make their own remedies. You all know this so well. Adoptees try to find their families, okay? We found the birth family with some help of some wonderful people. It took like 5 years though, back in South India, okay? People make their own remedies. Occasionally, an organization like ISS supports that or has a project to do that. Occasionally, a group of people in a country with a lot of misconduct organize to try to help people in an organized way, as has happened to some degree in South Korea. But when I say there's never been a remedy, I have not seen states acknowledge their obligation to make a systemic remedy available for adoptees in those countries at that end, and for birth families at the other end, to figure out what happened, number one, and to find each other if that's what they want to do. It's something that, you've got to hire somebody, you've got to know the right people, you got to do it largely on your own. And so in that sense, we've gone 70 years without a remedy. And I know this so well personally, we such agree that we don't have a remedy that they don't want you to remedy it. It's some years ago, but when I presented, again, I know this on tape, so I have sort of tacit permission over many years to talk about the illegal aspects of my own adoption from the various family members. I don't go into a whole lot how they're doing now, what their lives are now, because that's their lives and I'm not here to speak for them. But in terms of the adoption that my family was involved with, when we came to the point of presenting this to the Indian government, to the US government, to intermediaries, going to the places, the general attitudes we got were essentially silence. The Indian government lost our documents. They never acknowledged receiving them. CARA, the Central Authority for India. The US government, I filed an official complaint through the complaint registry. They never responded. Being a very privileged person, I even had the opportunity to give a speech in person at a special event organized so that members of the Central Authority in the US could hear about these practices, improper practices, and to present the facts of my own case and to show films of the painful reunion to them. And I was kind of hoping that would come out, maybe we should do something about it. But the answer has always been, we can't do anything about the past, we'll fix it in the future. And then it never gets fixed, never gets fixed, okay? Because that leads to impunity. If you're never dealing with the past, you're never really gonna fix it, okay? So I got to the point, after all these experiences, And then it was the repetitive nature. It was, there are people been in it a lot longer than I have. Our adoption was in 1998, 22 years ago, okay? But seeing years after I started to write about this, and I said before the tape, beginning, I started working with my wife, Desiree, a great deal. We worked together, we were a team. Some of us knew us as a team. She didn't get to have a university professorship the way I do, so she's less privileged, less known. She had a blog post that was great, Fleas Biting. So we worked on this together, and then all these promises. Oh, well, that was just your case. That's strange. It won't happen again. And then something would blow up, and then country after country kept happening. Guatemala happened after us. Ethiopia happened after us, and then it could go down through the list. So this sense that it's just going to go on forever. There has to be a stopping place. So what I proposed in this paper was very much what, in the spirit of what the Dutch government has announced, that there are systemic abuses, that it's very difficult to run an ethical system. I don't know if it can be done. Okay, I think it's possible to have a particular intercountry adoption that meets international standards. The problem is, as soon as you scale up, you just don't know who will be brought into that. So yes, you can find someone who's not corrupt in America, in Korea, in India, create a line, figure out who that child is. It's possible to do that on an individual basis. But when you try to create a system, and then money comes into that system, and then the demand for children from the receiving states come into that system, the ability to run a non-corrupt system, I don't know if that can be done. Okay, I just really don't know. And I don't know if it can be done even in some countries, certainly not universally, certainly not in every country can it be done. But essentially what you need to do is you need to stop. You need to do the work of dealing with the past. And then after you've heard those stories and you've gone through the painful process of watching people do these reunions or these failed searches or whatever arises, after you've seen all that human carnage and pain, then you've seen how difficult it is and how pervasive it is, then you can think about whether or not to reopen the system, but not until then. So that's the basic proposal. And as I see it, that's what the Dutch government has announced as of yesterday for them. So let me talk about the Dutch report a bit. Naturally, of course, I'm still absorbing it. We just got the English language version yesterday of the report. I do not read Dutch, so I'm not able to read the much longer report. But I want to highlight a couple of things about it and why I think this is an important moment for intercountry adoption. Okay. One of the first things I would say is that the Dutch report officially looked at 5 countries that sent children to the Netherlands: Bangladesh, Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. Those 5 countries over a specific period of time, 1967 to 1998. I have no inside knowledge as to why they picked those 5 countries in that particular period of time, why they didn't go a little earlier, why they didn't go later, but that's who they picked, okay? And what I like about the report, though, is that they didn't leave it there, okay? They basically acknowledge, as they put it, structural abuses related to intercountry adoption. And they said that this has been found to be, this on page 15 of the report, a near permanent structural problem. And then they're very specific that they believe that this, quote, continue to occur to this day all over the world. So although the investigation only went to 1997, they're not making one of those, oh, it was bad in the bad old days and it's okay now because we got the Hague and everything's okay. They're basically saying that they look more forward in time and they don't think it's changed. They also make it clear that, well, I'll just read this thing. The committee has established that similar abuses also took place before 1967, after 1998, and in other countries. And they say that then similar patterns are shared between those 5 countries and all of the other countries. So they're basically saying this is pervasive to intercountry adoption as we have known it in the modern world, okay? It's a stunning report in that way. It's one thing for a professor to say this, it's one thing for some, but this is a country saying it, It is really very, very different. A country that's been very involved for many years. Uh, so that's one key part of the report, the breadth of the acknowledgement of wrongdoing as opposed to the minimization. Another aspect of the report is, to a significant degree, owning the responsibility of the Dutch government. They knew way back in the 1960s they should have done it differently. It's not a matter of, oh, we were naive until such and such and that. No, there was enough information available for them that they should have known better. And I appreciate that, acknowledgement. Okay. And that acknowledgement as well on behalf of the Dutch intermediaries, as well as the government itself. Intermediaries, of course. And then, they just acknowledge, quote, the government did not act effectively to tackle abuses. Okay. And then they talk about why that happened, why these systemic failures. And here again, they are very clear. And some of this echoes a few points I made in my Moratoria article. I hope you don't mind me focusing on the report, though, because it's much more important what the Dutch government said than what I say. Okay, although you can read this for yourself, but it is very much one thing they say, which I said in my report, is that, but they can factually verify it, is that the government did not wish to jeopardize its good relations with other countries. I kind of wonder, and I'm not trying to be critical of this commission, but I kind of wonder, why didn't they include India? Why didn't they include China? Now, maybe, China's less important for the Dutch, but I think India has been an important country for them. I think whoever set it up, it's like India and China are more important. It's one of the things I said in my article. If you're trying to figure out, can we ever do an ethical system? The problem is that intercountry adoption is always going to be an insignificant issue for countries. And their relationship with important countries like the US, China, India is always going to be far more important to those countries than the ethics of their intercountry adoption system. So there's always going to be a pressure to, not be too blunt about what's going wrong, when you're involved with those other countries with these family formation things. And so that's one of those things. I don't know if that's fixable. It's not that hard for a powerful country to look at some of the less significant countries and say, oh, they're doing things wrong, okay, in almost kind of a snotty, overproud way. Of course, there's a problem with that as well, which is that essentially a lot of the receiving states, like the Netherlands, like the US, have always pushed responsibility onto the other country. And I'm going to talk about why that's not okay in a bit. But I don't think they're going to be willing to do that with China, India, and so forth. They're just not going to do it. So that's one thing they acknowledge. The other thing that they acknowledge really goes to the way they opened the report, which I thought was brilliant. And I don't speak Dutch, and maybe somebody who speaks Dutch can do this much better than I can. But they begin with this Dutch phrase I'm not even going to try to pronounce. Somebody else can come in and do that for me. But, quote, even if you only save one. And then they give the Dutch. It says these words spoken by Dutch writer, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name because I'll mangle it, in a television interview in 1967 marked the start of large-scale intercountry adoption in the Netherlands, even if you only save one. And it's this narrative that has made it very, very difficult for countries to be critical because it set the stage for the notion that you're saving children, you're saving human beings. And therefore, even if you bend some rules, even if some things aren't done quite right according to code, according to compliance rules, whatever it is, fundamentally, you're doing something that is so inherently good that it really doesn't matter when you cut those corners. The real point is to keep it going, keep it open. And the Dutch report sees that throughout as making it virtually impossible for their society to be critical of what was going on, even when there were signs right at the outset that things were not done correctly. Now, I would add to that, that in my experience, it seems to be, and this is a race problem and an ethnic problem, but it seems to be that and this is an oversimplification, and I'm sorry for that, and it's not always true and so forth, but it seems to have been difficult for people in rich developed countries, many of whom are white, they're not all white certainly, but many of whom are white, to perceive an Indian woman or a South Korean woman, as a single mother or as a poor Indian or a Cambodian or an Ethiopian, as a mother in the same way that they might see a birth mother in their own society or in their own race. I just have had that experience. I mean, I once had the opportunity again, with the permission, to show snippets of, meaning permission of relevant family members, to show snippets of the very painful reunion of one of my daughters with their mother in India. And and I did this at Harvard Law School. Some of you may know Professor Elizabeth Bartholet, and she's been very much on the opposite side of this issue with me for many years, but she was kind enough to invite me to a class that she teaches and have me debate one of her colleagues from another university. And I knew how difficult it would be to convey sort of the human weight of this, because the thing that we often get is, okay, your daughters were stolen from their family, but aren't they so much better off? I don't know if you've ever gotten that, but that aren't they so much better off? And I wanted them to see that, but even after showing that film, the individual that I was debating basically asked me that same question. So seeing the heartbreak and the wailing and the crying and the, and all of that, well, aren't they better off? And aren't you a good adoptive dad? Well, I don't know if I'm a good adoptive dad or not, but that's not really the point. I could be the best, I could be the worst. If they should not have left India, they should not have left India. If they shouldn't have left their family, they shouldn't have left their family. If their mother had been searching for them for years, she never should have been taken from them. But somehow when they saw her up on the screen, it just didn't click for some of them. You understand what I'm saying? There's a palpable just not seeing them as mothers or as parents in the full sense, or as families. And I think this, again, this is me. This is not the Dutch report, doesn't quite say this, but it's this we're saving them mentality, which goes along with the poverty as an indication and the other things that have been let slip by all these 70 years. So then there's the demand side. So you all know this, many of you scholars, but the way that intercountry adoption unfortunately has been structured is that countries that have very low fertility rates and countries that have a lot of people who want healthy young children, and where the supply of them in terms of domestic adoption is not very great. And I'm going to need to clarify what I mean by that in a few moments. Go to developing countries or to middle income countries, post-communist countries, and basically with kind of a wish list for kids. And in the context of international relations and the sort of the economic power of countries like the US, going to those countries with this sort of wish list for kids is just very powerful. It becomes a demand pull. And of course, on top of that demand pull, particularly the way the US does it, but even the way Europeans have done it, the way they did Guatemalan adoptions, the US is $20,000 for every healthy baby in a society that had endured, a more than 3 decade civil war, had a lot of extreme poverty, and these intermediaries were going to come away with 20,000 US dollars to spend and to keep on getting a healthy baby out of the country to an American. And you just can't do that and not think it won't be corrupted. I did a double negative there. I just never understood how people would not realize that if you threw that much money on the table in Guatemala, or even $4,000 or $5,000 in India, that you would corrupt the system. People are going to give you they're going to give you a quote orphan, and somebody is going to get wealthy. And that also has to do with the inequalities within countries. So typically intercountry adoption involves a wealthier class within, India or whatever, who is able to link to this demand side and to economically profit at the same time that they feel guilt-free because they are, as one Indian intermediary put it, taking a child from a bad mother and giving them to a good mother, it being sort of assumed that mothers in certain social classes were not very good mothers. And so that's a paraphrase from an actual intermediary in India. So, when a adoptee came home and wanted to meet her mother, well, I didn't do anything wrong. I took you from a bad mother and gave you to a good mother. A case where, according to the allegations, which I believe to be true, it was a impoverished single mother who'd gone in for childbirth to a hospital and been unable to pay the cost of the C-section that enveloped, and her inability to pay for that was used to extract the child from her. And it was not an unwanted in any way child. So all these things, the demand side, with or without money, the role of intermediaries, both in the receiving state and in the countries of origin, create a situation where it is so difficult to safeguard that initial step of making the child adoptable. How would you ever do that? How would you ever do that? Now, before I run out of time here, I want to pause, take a breath. I'll look forward to the questions about that. I appreciate the statement from Linnell, my friend on the chat, about the fact that the US was sending children to the Netherlands. So the US is in this ironic position of placing children to other countries, Canada and the Netherlands, significantly at a fair clip. And if you want to ask me more about that during the chat, or just have Linnell talk about that, we can do that. It shows you one of the paradoxes. And I'll say about that money talks there as well. That basically, if you take a African-American child who may be more difficult to place in the US, or if you can place them, you're not going to get much money for them. Literally in the US, private adoption agencies charge different amounts for infant private adoption based on the race of the child. And say a Black male child, African-American male child, would go at the lowest cost. But you take that same African-American male child and send him to the Netherlands or send him to Canada, and all of a sudden people are making a lot more money. So even in an adoption from the US, that kind of pull factor with money can operate. I'm also going to go back to what I talked earlier about what does it mean to say that there are not children available for adoption in countries like the US. And I would have to say that one of the tragedies of adoption is that the children in most, quote, need of adoption are the children least likely to be adopted. And so there's definitely a pecking order, and in the US, a price tag literal difference for intercountry or for domestic adoption, where a healthy baby of a particular race, and females are actually preferred for adoption in the US over males to some degree, not a huge difference, but somewhat. The older the child gets, the more the preference for female operates. And so there's like a pecking order. So an older African-American male teenager, you're not going to pay anything, or they'll be available through the foster care system, through the public system. But if you want a healthy baby of either gender, through the infant relinquishment adoption system, first of all, there are like several million people chasing. We have 20,000 infant relinquishment adoptions a year, several million people chasing them. So that's where the demand side spills over. But we actually have in the US more than 100,000 children in the public system cleared for domestic adoption, foster care, who have been removed, some say appropriately, some inappropriately, topic for a different day, but removed by the child welfare system for abuse or for neglect. But they're usually older, traumatized in multiple ways. And we have 100,000 cleared for adoption waiting, and not enough people to adopt them. So when we say there aren't, children available, it's really there are not children of a certain kind available, is what that really means. Okay, just to put that. Now, I want to reserve, again, there's just so much more I could say about intercountry adoption. I want to say one more thing about adoption, then try to talk about surrogacy, which is one of the things that's less in my writings, but I feel very, very strongly about. So I want to put it on the table, and I want to note the recent South Korean case that highlights this. I don't have permission to talk about it, so I won't use the name, but it's been in the media. And that is to say, I think that the way we have understood adoption in the full severance sense is just ethically and psychologically wrong. So I do think there are a certain number of children who safely or practically cannot be raised by their parent or parents. I think that's a reality. I mean, I also teach child abuse neglect law. And I mean, we have so many children every year in the US killed by their parents. So I don't think we can pretend that we can always maintain a child with their original parents. And I don't think we can pretend, I think that, there are some cases where it's just not safe to do so. And we can try to work with that family, but sometimes it just can't be done, okay? So I think there is a need for children to have families that are not their families of origin. Now, in the US system, we favor extended family, as we should, but sometimes extended family is not available, okay? So there is a need for something like adoption in the world. But I personally believe very strongly that the Western legal structure for that is fundamentally flawed. And that structure was basically created in the US and in other common law countries out of the single mother paradigm during the period of time when it was not acceptable in some social and class milieus for a single woman to keep her child. Some did anyway, many did anyway, but many did not. Particularly middle-class single women who became pregnant during what's called the baby scoop period of time in the US, Australia, the UK, other places, okay? Many of them common law. And the problem is that out of that, a system of adoption was developed that treated adoption as full severance, that you're only related to your adoptive family, you're completely unrelated to any of your birth family members, and of secrecy that was so strong that even the adoptee would never have a right to know their own origins. And there would be this kind of wall and all of the documents, new birth certificates, sealed original birth certificates, and so forth. And all that came out of the fact that most of these private adoptions were the single mother adoptions in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, okay? And this tidal wave of really terribly unethical domestic adoptions that we had during that period of time in many places, I think Australia as well, I should mention. So out of that, this model of full severance, secret, closed record adoption emerged. And this pretense that it is as if you were born to your adoptive family. And I think that this entire pretense that you're only related to your adoptive family is simply a false premise for us to do these things, that even when adoption is appropriate in the sense of a child, is better off almost all the time with a family, not quite all the time, but almost all the time in a family rather than in foster care temporarily or in a home or an orphanage. Institutional care does not work out very well. So I do think we need to have this notion of families taking in children and really considering them their own in a real way, so they'll truly invest in them, but they can't view them as only their own, as exclusively their own. And of course, this creates torment that many of you would know far better than I for adoptees, because it is natural to human beings to seek to know their origins. And yet that was treated for much of the history of adoption as a betrayal of the adoptive parents. A betrayal that's actually, I'll presume, more deeply felt when one has a good relationship with one within the adoptive family. And so we need to structure adoptive families at the outset to be open in a fundamentally different way. Now, sometimes the birth family, some people there may not be safe for the child when they're a child, but they need to know who they are and where they come from, and then have opportunities to make relationships out of that as appropriate. And adoptive parents need to be educated at the outset that this is what it means to be an adoptive parent. It is less exclusive than other things. It's more like a blended family. And of course, we often do blended families in the contemporary world. Finally, 2 minutes on surrogacy, because I'm going to run over and take away from my question time, or maybe 5 minutes on surrogacy or assisted reproductive technology. Huge topic. I have been a member of the group associated with the International Social Service trying to create international principles to guide surrogacy, both domestic and international. They're going to be called the Verona Principles. They should be available finally publicly later this month, okay? They're not perfect. They don't entirely represent my views or anyone else's views. They're much too much of a compromise document. But in that process, I was, very privileged to be about one of 10 people who put those together. And then we had consultations around the world and tried to listen to many voices. But in terms of the actual drafting, again, that doesn't mean that they reflect my own personal views, very much trying to do it from a child rights point of view. And one of the things I came away with, and I also teach bioethics and law, is this terrible sense that in assisted reproductive technology and in surrogacy, we're repeating the worst mistakes of what we've done with adoption. This whole as if model, at least in the US, permeates assisted reproductive technology. We don't even have an original birth certificate with the accurate information for, donor gametes, for surrogacies. That information is, totally absent from the legal record, even to be dug up. And the demand has been very strongly to, not have origins be available to people. Now, the UK does have that information available. Some countries do try to do that, but even so, of course, then there's the question, practically, how do you do it? Yes, people can rely on popular genetics sites to, search for their family, but in terms of as a legal protection of that information where it's regularly available, doing that in the ART surrogacy context is very, very different, very, very difficult. And then unfortunately, we're replicating this idea that somehow you can, join a privileged, wealthy family in Australia, Western Europe, America, with a developing country poor woman in India, Cambodia, Nepal, and on into other places, and somehow treat everybody humanely when there are intermediaries making huge profits along the way. And, I think that, that idea of a regulated and safe international global surrogacy market is not going to work out. And that's the other part, and I'll end on this. I've spent my entire career in this field trying to battle what are in essence markets in children. Maybe well-intentioned markets, but they're still markets, okay? And now, after working on that on the adoption side for years, I know surrogacy and ART are different from adoption. I know they open up opportunities for family formation for groups that are very important. I know there are things on the other side of this debate, but I just have to send up a warning flag that those who try to meet those family formation goals through a globalized marketplace that is explicitly a marketplace. At least with adoption, we pretended it wasn't the marketplace. Sometimes pretense can help us act a little better. The commercial surrogacy market is one of my articles is called the $100,000 baby, and that's cheap. It's a segmented market. The American surrogacies are, 100,000 plus. Then there are the middle income country surrogacies, Ukraine, Russia, less than that on the commercial surrogacy side. And then you go to the developing countries for your least expensive surrogacies. And the idea that you could have these global marketplaces and have it work out in family formation, and then not have rights of origins or information and not protect the information and then expect it not to be corrupted. I understand the impetus to do that. The desire to have a child genetically related or to have a child not genetically related, the desire to form families is generally a positive thing. There are a lot of good intentions. The desire to allow all kinds of people to form families is generally a positive thing, if you understand what I'm saying. But, are you going to violate the lessons we've learned about commercializing family formation, about origins as you do that? And that's the warning flag I'd like to put up there about that topic. Okay, I think now is when I'm supposed to be stopping. Is that about right to my hosts?
Thank you very much.